On the morning of December 22, 1944, a German lieutenant named Helmuth Henke walked up a snow-covered road toward the American lines outside a Belgian town called Bastogne. He was carrying a briefcase and a white flag. Inside the briefcase was a typed letter. The letter gave the Americans 2 hours to surrender or be destroyed. Henke spoke good English, and he had been chosen for that reason. He believed, as every officer in his corps believed that morning, that the men inside Bastogne were finished. They were surrounded. They were freezing. They were low on ammunition, low on food, and low on medicine. By every calculation the German command could make, the only sane choice left to the Americans was to give up. Henke had been a soldier long enough to know how a trapped army behaves. He had seen it in France, and he had seen it in the East. When a force is encircled and starving and cut off from rescue, it bends, it negotiates, it looks for terms. That was the natural order of war, and the letter in his briefcase was an invitation to follow that order. It was, in the German view, almost a courtesy, a way to spare thousands of men a pointless death 2 days before Christmas. What Henke could not have known, as his boots pressed into the snow on the Arlon road, was that the answer waiting for him would become one of the most famous single words in the history of warfare. He could not have known that the reply would be so short that the German officers reading it would not understand it. He could not have known that it would confuse the German command so completely that they would have to ask the Americans to explain what it meant. And he could not have known that, decades later, soldiers and historians would still be trying to understand the thing that single word revealed about the army he was facing. If this story moves you, a like helps it reach others who care about these men. And if you are new here, consider subscribing. To understand why the German surrender demand failed at Bastogne, and why it failed in a way that puzzled the men who delivered it, you have to understand what the Germans thought they were looking at. In the third week of December 1944, the German army launched the largest offensive it had mounted in the West since the fall of France. It came through the Ardennes, a region of thick forest and narrow roads on the border of Belgium and Luxembourg. The Americans called what followed the Battle of the Bulge, because of the great bulge the German advance punched into the Allied line. Hitler had gambled almost everything on it. He had stripped reserves from across the Reich, refitted shattered panzer divisions in secret, and thrown 250,000 men at a thinly held stretch of front held by tired and inexperienced American units. The offensive had a name. The Germans called it Watch on the Rhine, a deliberately defensive-sounding title chosen to disguise what was in truth a desperate attack. The plan was bold to the point of fantasy. 3 German armies would burst out of the forest, cross the Meuse River, and drive all the way to the port of Antwerp on the Belgian coast. Taking Antwerp would split the Allied armies in 2, cutting the British and Canadian forces in the north off from the Americans in the south. Hitler believed that such a blow might shatter the alliance against him, or at least force the Western Allies to the negotiating table and free Germany to turn its full strength against the Soviets in the East. It was a gambler's plan, built on the hope that surprise, bad flying weather, and a single hard punch could change the course of a war that Germany was otherwise losing on every front. For a time, the surprise worked. The attack fell on a quiet stretch of the American line, held by units that were either worn out from earlier fighting or brand new and untested. The German preparations had been hidden with great skill, radio traffic kept low, movement done at night, the build-up masked by the very forests the attack would come through. When the blow landed in the pre-dawn dark of December 16, behind a thunderous artillery barrage, many American units were caught completely off guard. Some were overrun before they understood that a major offensive was underway at all. In the first days, whole regiments were surrounded and forced to surrender, and the German spearheads tore westward into the gap they had opened. At the center of the German plan sat a small market town. Bastogne was not large and it was not famous, but it was a road hub. 7 paved roads met there, like spokes meeting at the center of a wheel. In the dead of an Ardennes winter, with the side ground frozen 1 hour and turned to mud the next, an army that wanted to move fast needed those roads. German tanks and trucks and guns could not simply drive across open country in that terrain and that weather. They needed the road network, and the road network ran through Bastogne. Whoever held the town controlled the pace of the entire German advance toward the Meuse River. The German commanders understood this perfectly. So did the Americans. And that is why both sides poured toward a place that, a week earlier, almost no one outside Belgium had ever heard of. Now here is the first thing that has to be made clear, because it sits at the heart of this story, and because it is the single most common mistake people make about Bastogne. The men who surrounded the town were not the Waffen-SS. The famous surrender demand did not come from an SS general. The soldiers tightening the ring around Bastogne belonged to the German army proper, the Heer, under the 5th Panzer Army, commanded by General Hasso von Manteuffel. The corps doing the encircling was the 47th Panzer Corps, led by General Heinrich von Luttwitz. Its divisions were the 2nd Panzer Division, the Panzer Lehr Division, and the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, with parachute troops screening to the south. The SS were elsewhere. To the north, a separate German army, the 6th Panzer Army under Sepp Dietrich, drove its SS divisions forward in a different sector entirely. That was where the notorious SS battle group under Joachim Peiper carved its path, and where the worst atrocities of the campaign occurred. Those units never took part in the siege of Bastogne, and never sent the surrender demand. This distinction matters, and not only for the sake of accuracy. It matters because the men who actually stood outside Bastogne were professional soldiers of the regular army, men with long experience and real tactical skill, and their bafflement at what the Americans did was not the reaction of fanatics. It was the considered judgment of competent professionals who thought they had seen everything war could show them, and they had not. But before we get to what they could not understand, we need to understand what they were looking at. And that story does not begin at Bastogne. It begins more than 100 miles away, in a camp in France, where the men who would defend the town were resting when the order came that changed everything. In the middle of December 1944, the United States 101st Airborne Division was not expecting to fight. The division had jumped into Normandy in June and into the Netherlands in September during Operation Market Garden. After Holland, it had been pulled back to Camp Mourmelon near Reims in France to rest and refit. The men were exhausted and badly under strength. They had handed in much of their equipment. Many were on leave in Paris. Replacements were still trickling in to fill the gaps left by months of hard fighting. The division was, in every practical sense, in no condition to be thrown into a major battle on short notice. There was another problem. The division commander, Major General Maxwell Taylor, was not even in Europe. He had been called back to the United States for a staff conference in Washington. His assistant division commander was in England attending a lecture series. That meant that when the emergency came, the 101st Airborne would go into the most desperate fight of its existence without its top 2 officers. Command fell instead to the senior man present, the division artillery commander, a 46-year-old brigadier general named Anthony McAuliffe. When the German offensive smashed into the American line on December 16th, the Allied command scrambled for reserves. The 2 airborne divisions resting in France, the 82nd and the 101st, were the only fresh formations within reach. They were ordered north into Belgium at once. On the afternoon of December 18, the 101st began loading into trucks. These were open cattle trucks and cargo haulers, packed with men in the freezing rain and snow, grinding north through the dark over more than 100 miles of bad roads. Some men had no helmets, some had no winter coats. Many had only a few rounds of ammunition each, or none at all, expecting to be resupplied when they arrived. They reached the area around Bastogne in the early hours of December 19, climbing stiff and cold out of the trucks into a situation that no one fully understood yet. What they walked into was a collapsing front. Units that had been holding the line east of Bastogne were being overrun and pushed back in confusion. Roads were jammed with retreating vehicles and frightened men. Rumors ran ahead of the Germans, and some of those rumors were true. As the paratroopers moved up toward the town, they passed soldiers moving the other way. There is a moment, recorded in more than one account, that captures the strangeness of those first hours. Retreating men, shocked and demoralized, were giving away their ammunition to the paratroopers heading toward the fight, because the paratroopers wanted it, and they no longer did. The men going in were collecting bullets from the men coming out. That detail tells you something important about the 101st. They were not a fresh army arriving in good order with full supplies. They were tired men, scraped together, short of nearly everything, walking into a battle whose shape no one could yet see. And yet they walked in. The contrast between the two streams of soldiers on those frozen roads, one moving away from Bastogne and one moving toward it, is the whole story of the siege in miniature. While the Americans were forming up inside the town, the German divisions were flowing around it. But before the ring closed, there was hard fighting to be done on the roads leading in, and that fighting decided whether there would be a defense at all. The race for Bastogne was, in its first hours, a contest to see whether the Americans could get enough men into the town before the Germans arrived in strength. Every hour that the German advance could be delayed on the eastern approaches was an hour the defenders inside could use to dig in and organize. So small American forces were pushed out along the roads to the east to meet the German columns and slow them down. These were sacrificial missions in everything but name. A handful of tanks and a few hundred infantry could not stop a panzer division, but they could make it stop, deploy, and fight, and each time it did, it lost time. East of the town, an armored team built around tanks of the 10th Armored Division and paratroopers of the 101st fought a series of sharp delaying actions at crossroads and in villages, trading ground for hours. Some of these forces were cut off and destroyed, others fought until they were nearly surrounded, and then pulled back to the next defensible spot to do it again. They bought the time the garrison needed, and many of the men who bought it did not come back. The defense of Bastogne would not be the work of the paratroopers alone. As the 101st arrived, so did pieces of other shattered or scattered commands, and the way they fused together is itself part of the answer to the puzzle that would soon baffle the German envoys. Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division had reached the town first, sent ahead to buy time, and it was its tanks that fought many of those early delaying actions on the eastern roads. There were tank destroyers from the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion, lightly armored vehicles with powerful guns, racing in from the north. There were field artillery battalions, including the 969th, an African-American unit whose howitzers would fire some of the most important rounds of the siege. And there were hundreds of stragglers, men separated from their own destroyed or retreating units, gathered up and reorganized into a scratch force that the defenders nicknamed Team Snafu. This was a polyglot garrison, assembled from the wreckage of a broken front and stitched together under pressure. It had no single chain of command that had trained together for this fight. It had paratroopers, tankers, gunners, engineers, and lost infantrymen, thrown into the same perimeter and told to hold. By the standards of the German army, this should have been a weakness. A force assembled from fragments, without a unified command tradition, was exactly the kind of force that was supposed to come apart when the pressure rose. Instead, it held together and fought as one. How a scratch force of strangers managed that, and why the seemingly hopeless picture the Germans saw on their maps was not the picture the defenders saw, is the thread that runs through everything that follows. There is a crucial tactical fact about Bastogne that shaped everything else. The Germans did not at first try to take the town by storming straight into it. Their orders were to reach the Meuse River, and Bastogne was an obstacle on the way, not the objective itself. So the panzer divisions split and flowed around the town on both sides, like a river parting around a stone, leaving a screening force to deal with the defenders. By December 21, that flow had closed behind the town. The roads were cut. Bastogne was surrounded. Inside the perimeter were roughly 11,000 men of the 101st, with the attached armor, artillery, and stragglers bringing the total to somewhere around 18 to 20,000. Around them, and growing stronger each day, were German forces that outnumbered them. The defenders held a rough circle a few miles across, with the town at its center and the 7 roads radiating outward. Every one of those roads was now a potential axis of German attack. The defenders had to watch all of them at once. The conditions inside that circle were brutal. It was one of the coldest winters in living memory. Snow lay deep across the fields and forests. Temperatures fell well below freezing, and the men had no proper winter clothing. Foxholes filled with freezing water. Frostbite and trench-foot crippled men who never saw a German. There was little food. There was, critically, little ammunition. The artillery, the backbone of the defense, was so short of shells that by December 22, the gunners were rationed to 10 rounds per gun per day. 10 rounds to cover an entire day of a siege across a perimeter under attack from several directions at once. The gunners had to choose their targets with brutal economy, holding their fire until a German attack was so close and so dangerous that the rounds could not be wasted. There was one stroke of luck. When the defenders organized the town, they found an abandoned American medical supply depot inside it, which gave them bandages and basic supplies they would otherwise have lacked. But that luck was balanced by a disaster that struck on the very first night. On December 19th, German reconnaissance troops overran the division's main medical company in the dark, northwest of the town. They captured most of its doctors, its surgeons, its equipment, and over 100 enlisted medical men in a single stroke. The men were tending the wounded when the German armored cars and troops appeared out of the darkness, and there was nothing to be done. The whole clearing station, the place where the division's most badly hurt men were supposed to be operated on and saved, was simply gone, carried off into captivity before the siege had properly begun. In one night, the defenders of Bastogne lost almost their entire surgical capability. For the days that followed, badly wounded men who needed an operation to live often could not get one. There were aid stations, and there were brave medics and a handful of doctors, and there were 2 Belgian civilian nurses who worked among the wounded with extraordinary courage, washing wounds, comforting the dying, and stretching the thin supplies as far as they would go. But the deep surgical skill needed for the worst cases had been carried off into captivity on the first night. Men died in Bastogne who would have lived if that medical company had not been lost. Their deaths were among the cruelest arithmetic of the siege. Lives lost not to any failure of courage, but to the simple absence of a surgeon's hands. This, then, was the situation that the German command surveyed on December 22. A surrounded town, a garrison outnumbered and cut off, no relief in sight, bitter cold, ammunition running low, wounded men dying for lack of surgeons, fog so thick that for days no Allied aircraft could fly in to drop supplies or strike at the German troops. From the German point of view, the equation was simple. The defenders were in a hopeless position. A reasonable enemy, offered honorable terms, would take them, and so the German command decided to offer those terms. This is the moment where the story turns, and it is worth slowing down, because what happened next is so often told as a single punchline that the strangeness of it gets lost. The decision to demand surrender came from General von Luttwitz, the commander of the 47th Panzer Corps. The exact path of the decision is one of the small mysteries of the battle, and it deserves to be told honestly rather than tidied up. The official United States Army history notes that the surrender note was signed only with the words, "the German commander," and that none of the German generals in the sector afterward seemed eager to claim authorship of it. That hesitation is telling. After the war, when historians went looking for the man who had written the ultimatum, they found the German commanders pointing away from themselves. Manteuffel, who led the 5th Panzer Army, stated plainly that the surrender demand had been made without his authorization, and said he was never sure exactly who had authorized it. None of the senior German commanders in the sector wanted to claim it, and several quietly distanced themselves from it after the fact. The weight of the evidence points to Luttwitz and his corps staff as the origin, acting on their own initiative, which is exactly why the note was signed anonymously and why no one wanted to put his name to it later. They were confident enough to make the demand, and just uncertain enough about it to leave it unsigned. The note itself was a strange document. It was typed in both English and German. It opened with a grand and slightly theatrical line about the fortune of war changing. It listed the German advances around the town, the places that had supposedly fallen, to drive home how complete the encirclement was. Then it came to its point. There was, it said, Only one possibility to save the encircled American troops from total annihilation, and that was the honorable surrender of the town. The Americans were given 2 hours to think it over. If they refused, the note warned, a German artillery corps and 6 battalions of heavy anti-aircraft guns stood ready to annihilate them. And then, in a final flourish that would have been almost comic if the stakes had been lower, the note expressed concern for the civilian casualties that such a bombardment would cause, noting that such losses would not correspond with the well-known American humanity. 4 men carried this note toward the American lines under a white flag. Late in the morning of December 22, there was a major from the corps staff named Wagner. There was Lieutenant Helmuth Henke from the Panzer Lehr Division, who spoke English and carried the briefcase. And there were 2 enlisted men. They walked up the Arlon Road, southeast of the town, toward a stretch of the perimeter held by F Company of the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment. What happened when they reached the American foxholes has the texture of something real rather than something invented, full of small confusions and ordinary men. The first American to see them was a private in a forward foxhole. The Germans came forward with their white flag. American soldiers walked out to meet them. Henke announced in English that they came as parlementaires, as bearers of a formal message, and that they wished to speak to the American commander. The Americans blindfolded the 2 officers, as the rules of war allowed, and led them back through the lines while the message was passed up the chain. A German-speaking American medic named Ernest Premetz was on hand to help with translation. A staff sergeant named Carl Dickinson was among the men who received the party. These are not famous names. They were ordinary soldiers at the end of a frozen road, suddenly handed a piece of history they had not asked for. The written demand made its way back to the town and eventually to the headquarters where General McAuliffe was. And here we reach the famous moment. When McAuliffe was first roused and told that the Germans were demanding the surrender of his garrison, his immediate, almost offhand reaction was a single dismissive word: nuts. He said it the way a man says something when an idea is so absurd it barely deserves a response. Then he put it aside and turned to other business, because there was a great deal of other business, and the German demand struck him as not worth serious worry. But the Germans had asked for a written reply, and that created an odd little problem. McAuliffe sat down to compose a formal answer and found himself at a loss. He said something to the effect that he did not know what to tell them. One of his officers, Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kinnard, spoke up. He pointed out that the general's first reaction had been hard to beat. McAuliffe asked what he meant. Kinnard reminded him, "The first thing you said, sir, you said nuts." The room agreed at once. It was perfect. And so the most powerful army in the world, surrounded and outnumbered, and offered a path to surrender, sent back its reply on a clean sheet of paper. To the German commander, nuts. The American commander. The job of delivering this answer fell to Colonel Joseph Harper, who commanded the Glider Infantry Regiment holding that part of the line. Harper took the typed reply back out to the perimeter, where the 2 blindfolded German officers were waiting. And now came the genuinely strange part, the part that turns this from a good story into a window onto something deeper. Harper handed the Germans the reply. They read it, and they did not understand it. This is not a detail that storytellers usually dwell on, but it is the hinge of the whole episode. The German officers, fluent as one of them was in English, were faced with a single word, nuts, and could not make sense of it as an answer to a surrender demand. They asked whether the reply was affirmative or negative. They genuinely did not know. Harper, growing irritated, told them it was decidedly not affirmative. Then he made it plain in language no one could misread. He told them that nuts, in plain English, meant the same thing as go to hell, the medic translated. And Harper went further. If the Germans kept attacking, he warned them, the Americans would kill every German who tried to break into the town. One of the German officers answered, with a kind of grim professional courtesy, that they would kill many Americans, and that this was war. Harper sent them on their way, and in a moment he later said he regretted, he even wished them good luck. Now step back and look at what had just happened through German eyes. because this is where the puzzle begins to take shape. The Germans had done everything by the book. They had assessed the situation correctly. The Americans really were surrounded, really were outnumbered, and really were short of everything an army needs to survive. The German command had offered terms that, by the cold arithmetic of war, the Americans should have wanted. And the answer that came back was not a counterproposal. It was not a request for time. It was not even a clear no. It was a piece of slang so casual, so dismissive, that the men who received it could not at first tell whether it was an acceptance or a refusal. They had to be told that it meant, "Go to hell." To a German officer of the old school, schooled in a tradition where war was a serious and formal business conducted between professionals, this was almost incomprehensible. Not the refusal itself. A determined enemy might refuse, but the manner of it. The sheer breezy contempt of the reply suggested that the American commander did not regard his position as desperate at all. It suggested that the demand had struck him as not frightening, but ridiculous. And that was the part the Germans could not reconcile with what they were seeing on their maps. By every measure they trusted, Bastogne was doomed. The man inside Bastogne was acting as though it were not. One of those two readings of the situation was wrong, and the Germans were about to find out which. The threatened annihilation, it should be said, did not come the way the note promised. There was no single overwhelming artillery corps that flattened the town in the 2 hours after the deadline. The German guns around Bastogne were not as concentrated or as well supplied as the grand language of the ultimatum suggested. The Germans shelled the town, and they would mount fierce attacks in the days that followed, but the apocalyptic bombardment described in the note never materialized in the form it threatened. This too is part of the story. The demand had been, in part, a bluff dressed in formal language, an attempt to win by intimidation what the Germans were not certain they could win by force. The man who answered nuts may not have known the precise state of the German guns, but he had judged the deeper truth correctly. The demand was a sign of German impatience, not German strength. What the German command had run into at Bastogne was not simply stubbornness. Stubbornness alone does not hold a surrounded town against heavy odds for days on end. What held Bastogne was the way the defense was spread across the whole perimeter, and the refusal of the men holding it to accept the hopeless picture the Germans were sure of. To understand it, you have to look at how the defense actually worked in the days around the ultimatum, because the answer the Germans could not read on that sheet of paper was being written at the same moment all around the perimeter. Consider what was being asked of the defenders. They held a rough circle with the town at its center, and the German attacks could come down any of the 7 roads, or across the frozen fields between them, at any hour of the day or night. A defending force in that position cannot wait for orders from the center every time a threat appears. There is no time. The man on the perimeter who sees German tanks emerging from the tree line at dawn cannot send a runner to the town, wait for the message to climb the chain of command, wait for a decision to come back down, and only then act. By the time the order arrived, the position would be overrun. The defense of Bastogne worked because, again and again, the men at the threatened point did not wait. They acted. Take the fight at the village of Noville, north of the town, in the first days of the siege. A small armored task force under a young major named William de Sobry, barely in his middle 20s, was pushed out to Noville to meet the German 2nd Panzer Division as it came on. De Sobry's force was tiny compared to what was coming at it, and it was hit by tanks and infantry far stronger than itself. De Sobry asked for and received permission to make his own decision about whether to hold or pull back, and he chose to fight. His outnumbered task force, joined by paratroopers, held the village far longer than anyone had a right to expect, blunting the spearhead of an entire panzer division and buying the defenders inside Bastogne precious time to organize. De Sobry himself was badly wounded and captured. The point is not only that one man was brave, though he was, it is that the defense depended on officers and men at the threatened points acting fast on their own read of the situation, rather than waiting on word from the center that, in the chaos of those first days, might never come in time. This pattern repeated all around the perimeter, and it is the key to why the surrender demand misjudged the defenders so badly. The German calculation treated Bastogne as a single trapped object that could be pressured into collapse, threaten the commander, show him a hopeless picture, and the town would yield. But the defense did not depend on one man being frightened into surrender. It had a McAuliffe at the center, yes, but it also had a Desaubry at Noville, and a tank commander on the eastern road, and an artillery officer choosing where to spend his 10 precious rounds, and a sergeant in a foxhole deciding when to fire and when to hold. The fight was being held together at 100 points around the circle at once. A surrender demand delivered to the commander did nothing to change the dozens of separate struggles, scattered across miles of frozen perimeter, that were actually deciding whether the town held. You could deliver a letter to one general. You could not deliver it to the whole of a defense that was spread that widely and fighting that hard. The Germans kept attacking, and the defenders kept improvising answers. When tanks broke through at one point, gunners depressed their howitzers and fired over open sights at the armor, a desperate measure that turned artillery pieces into direct fire weapons. When a road was threatened, men were shifted to meet the threat from quieter parts of the line, and the men doing the shifting often did not wait to be told. The thinness of the defense, which should have been a fatal weakness, was managed by the willingness of men at every level to take responsibility for the patch of ground in front of them. This is the thing the surrender note could not see, and could not have changed even if McAuliffe had been frightened. The defense of Bastogne did not run through one man, it ran through all of them. There is a contrast here, but it is not the one people often reach for, and it is worth getting right. It is tempting to say that the Americans won because they pushed decisions down to their junior men while the Germans clung to rigid top-down control. That would be false, and any serious student of the war would object to it. The German army was, in fact, the great pioneer of decentralized command. Its tradition of mission orders, of telling a subordinate what to achieve and leaving him to work out how, ran back through a century of Prussian thought and was woven deep into the way German officers were trained. If anything, the Germans had taught the world that initiative should reach down to the lowest levels. So the difference at Bastogne was not that the Americans had invented something the Germans lacked. The difference was in the situation, and in how each side could bring its strength to bear. The defenders sat on interior lines, inside a tight circle with the town at the center, which meant they could shift men and mass their artillery quickly from one threatened point to another. Their guns, once resupplied, could concentrate the fire of many battalions onto a single attacking column in minutes. Their tankers, gunners, engineers and paratroopers, thrown together though they were, fought as a flexible combined force, each arm covering the others. The Germans, by contrast, were divided against themselves. Their best armored divisions had been ordered to bypass the town and push for the Meuse, so the force left to crush Bastogne was never able to attack everywhere at once. They came at the perimeter in sequence rather than all together, short of fuel, worn down, and strung out around a wide ring. Again and again the defenders could meet one blow, beat it, and then turn to face the next, because the next had not landed at the same time. It was not that the Germans could not improvise, it was that the shape of the battle never let them bring their full weight down in one place at one moment, and the Americans, on the inside of the circle, could. Then, on December 23, the sky changed. For days the fog had sat heavy over the Ardennes, grounding the Allied air forces and leaving the defenders to fight without the supplies and air support that might have eased their situation. On the 23rd, the weather finally broke. The skies cleared to brilliant winter blue, and what the Germans saw overhead must have been a sickening sight. American transport planes came in waves over Bastogne, and from their bellies fell a snowstorm of colored parachutes carrying ammunition, food, medicine, and fuel to the men below. Pathfinders had dropped in first to set up beacons and mark the drop zones. Behind them came the cargo planes, hundreds of them over the following days, threading through German anti-aircraft fire to deliver what the garrison needed to keep fighting. The resupply transformed the situation inside the perimeter. The scale of it was enormous. Over the days that the air bridge operated, hundreds of transport planes flew the run to Bastogne, and the tonnage they delivered ran well over 1,000 tons of supplies dropped by parachute, with more brought in by glider. They carried ammunition by the ton, including the artillery shells the gunners needed most. They carried rations and medical supplies and thousands of gallons of fuel. The gunners who had been rationed to 10 rounds a day suddenly had shells again. Men who had been hungry had rations. The wounded got medicine, and on the days that followed, gliders came in as well, bringing not only supplies but, at last, surgeons. Volunteer surgical teams flown in from outside finally gave the defenders the deep medical skill they had lost on the first night. Fighter planes ranged over the German positions, strafing and bombing the troops that had been pressing in on the town. The defenders were no longer a garrison slowly strangling in the fog. They were a garrison being fed, armed and supported, and they knew it. The cold and the danger did not end with the clearing of the skies. The Germans mounted some of their fiercest assaults after the weather broke, and the heaviest came on Christmas Day itself. The German commander outside the town had concluded that he could not afford to leave Bastogne unconquered any longer, and he gathered what armor and infantry he could for one concentrated blow aimed at the western side of the perimeter, where he judged the defense to be thinnest. In the grey light of Christmas morning, German tanks and infantry struck hard and broke clean through the outer line, driving armor right into the edge of the defended area. For a few hours the situation was genuinely dangerous, more dangerous in some ways than it had been during the days of the surrender demand, but the breakthrough was met by paratroopers, tank destroyers, and gunners firing at point-blank range, and the German tanks that had punched through were hunted down and destroyed one by one inside the perimeter. By the end of the day the attack had been broken, the line restored, and the last serious German chance to take Bastogne by storm had been spent. The defenders had held through the worst the Germans could throw, and they had held it on Christmas Day. On Christmas Eve, with his men cold and tired and far from home, McAuliffe wrote them a message. It was not the message of a man who thought he was about to be overrun. He acknowledged the obvious. They were fighting, it was cold, and they were not home. All true, he wrote. But then he reminded them of what they had done. They had stopped cold everything the Germans had thrown at them from every direction. He listed the German divisions they had identified pressing against the perimeter to show his men the scale of what they were holding off, and he reproduced, in full, the German surrender demand and his own one-word reply, so that every soldier in the garrison would know exactly what had been asked of them and exactly how their commander had answered. He told them they were giving their country and their families a worthy Christmas present, and that taking part in this fight was something that would be written about in history. It was a message designed to turn a desperate situation into a source of pride, and from the accounts of the men who received it, it worked. That same Christmas Eve brought one of the cruelest moments of the siege. German aircraft bombed the town after dark, and one of the bombs struck a building being used to shelter the wounded. Among those killed was one of the 2 Belgian nurses who had worked so tirelessly among the injured men. She had stayed with the wounded rather than seek safety, and she died with them. The defenders had answered a surrender demand with defiance, but defiance did not make them invulnerable, and the cost of holding Bastogne was paid in moments like that one, in the dark, on Christmas Eve. By now the German command was facing a problem that ran deeper than one stubborn town. Their entire offensive depended on speed. The plan was to reach the Meuse and beyond before the Allies could recover and concentrate their overwhelming strength. Every day that Bastogne held, the German timetable slipped further behind. The roads the Germans needed ran through a town they could not take, forcing their traffic onto worse routes and tangling their advance. The defenders, simply by refusing to quit, were strangling the offensive that was supposed to be strangling them. The surrender demand had been, in part, an attempt to remove this obstacle cheaply, to talk the Americans out of a position the Germans were finding expensive to take by force. When the demand failed, the Germans were left to do it the hard way, and the hard way was costing them time they did not have. Help was already on the way, though the men inside Bastogne could not be certain of it. To the south, General George Patton's Third Army had performed one of the most remarkable feats of the war. When the German offensive struck, Patton's army was facing east, in the middle of its own campaign in the Saar region of Germany. At a meeting of the senior Allied commanders on December 19th, Patton was asked how quickly he could turn part of his army north to strike the southern flank of the German Bulge and drive on Bastogne. His answer astonished the room. He said he could attack with 3 divisions in a matter of days. To pull an army that is attacking in one direction, stop it, wheel it 90 degrees, and send it attacking in a completely different direction, all in the dead of winter and over icy roads, is one of the hardest things an army can be asked to do. Patton's staff had already begun planning for it, and they pulled it off, swinging the weight of an army onto a new axis in a matter of days. Leading the drive toward the town was the 4th Armored Division. Its tanks ground north through German resistance, fighting for every village along the road, getting closer to the perimeter day by day. On December 26, the relief came. A battalion of the 4th Armored, commanded by a lieutenant colonel named Creighton Abrams, made the final push. Abrams watched the supply planes flying over toward Bastogne and decided to make a direct dash for the town through the village of Assenois. A massive concentration of American artillery hammered the village and the woods around it, and the tanks charged through. In the late afternoon, a Sherman tank named Cobra King, a heavily armored model built for exactly this kind of assault, commanded by a lieutenant named Charles Boggis, rolled up to the southern edge of the perimeter and met the engineers of the 101st Airborne holding the line there. The first words exchanged between the relieving force and the defenders were ordinary and almost anticlimactic. 2 American officers shaking hands at the end of a frozen road, the corridor to Bastogne pried open at last. It is worth being careful about how this relief is remembered, because the popular version distorts it, and the truth is more interesting than the legend. The story is often told as Patton rescuing a garrison on the brink of destruction, snatching the 101st from the jaws of defeat at the final hour. The men of the 101st never accepted that version, and they had a point. They did not regard themselves as having been rescued. McAuliffe and his officers maintained that they had never been in danger of being overrun, that they could have held on. Whether or not that confidence was entirely justified, the relief did not save a beaten force. It opened a road to a force that was still fighting hard and still holding its ground. The arrival of the 4th Armored ended the encirclement and allowed the wounded to be evacuated and the defenders to be reinforced. It did not turn a defeat into a victory. The victory had already been won every day that the town did not fall. The opening of the corridor on December 26 did not end the fighting. The road into Bastogne was narrow and exposed, and for days the Germans tried to cut it again and to crush the town they had failed to take. Some of the hardest fighting of the whole battle came after the relief, as fresh German units, including SS divisions, shifted down from the northern sector, threw themselves at the Bastogne perimeter in early January in an attempt to finish what the encirclement had started. They failed in that too. The corridor held, reinforcements and supplies flowed in, the wounded were carried out at last, and the 101st, far from being withdrawn to rest, stayed in the line and went over to the attack. The cost of all this was heavy. The defense and the fighting around it killed and wounded thousands of Americans, and the division that had answered a surrender demand with a single word paid for its defiance in the snow over many days. The town itself was battered, its people having endured shelling and bombing and the terror of an army at their doors. Bastogne was held, but it was not held cheaply. Now we come back to the puzzle, because the relief of Bastogne does not answer it. It only sharpens it. The German command had looked at a surrounded, outnumbered, freezing, undersupplied garrison and concluded, reasonably, that it would surrender if pressed. They were professionals, and their judgment was sound by the standards of the war they had fought across Europe. And they were wrong. The question is why? Why did the men inside Bastogne not behave the way trapped armies were supposed to behave? Part of the answer is the one we have already seen. The defense was spread across the whole perimeter, with no single point whose collapse would bring down the rest, so a demand aimed at the commander could not reach the dozens of separate fights that were actually holding the town. But there is a deeper layer beneath that one, And it is the layer the German envoys brushed against without understanding when they read that single contemptuous word and could not pass it. The German officers came from a military tradition in which the decision to fight or surrender was a weighty, formal thing, a matter for commanders, governed by rules and proprieties. When they offered honorable terms to a hopeless position, they expected those terms to be weighed with the same seriousness they brought to them. What they got instead was a reply that treated the entire premise as absurd. Nuts. The word did not engage with the German logic at all. It refused the frame. It said, in effect, that the question of surrender was not even a real question, not worth a serious sentence, let alone a negotiation. And the reason McAuliffe could answer that way, the reason the answer was not bravado, but something closer to simple fact, is that the army he commanded did not regard its situation as the Germans did. To the German command, an encircled force was a force that had lost. Encirclement was, in their doctrine and their experience, very close to defeat itself. To the American defenders, encirclement was a tactical problem to be solved, an uncomfortable situation to be endured until it could be reversed. The paratroopers of the 101st in particular were prepared for it in a way most soldiers were not. An airborne division expects to land behind enemy lines and to fight while cut off from friendly ground forces. Being surrounded was not, for them, the unthinkable disaster it might be for an ordinary unit. It was a condition their whole way of war anticipated. That did not make a week-long siege by tanks and heavy guns, short of ammunition and winter clothing and surgeons, anything close to comfortable or routine. It was a brutal and improvised stand, but the men holding the line did not carry the assumption, so natural to their enemy, that to be surrounded was already to be beaten. Where a German commander saw a closing trap, the paratroopers saw a hard job they had half expected to face. This is the thing the surrender demand could not account for and could not have overcome. It was aimed at an army that did not share the assumption on which the demand depended. The note assumed that the defenders, shown a hopeless picture, would agree that it was hopeless, but the defenders did not agree. They looked at the same map the Germans looked at, the same encirclement, the same odds, and they drew a different conclusion, because the meaning of those facts was different inside their heads. Surrounded, outnumbered, and short of supplies, they still believed they could hold, and so the German demand did not frighten them. It struck them as the thing you say to an enemy you have not yet beaten and are not sure you can beat, which is exactly what it was. The German command never solved this puzzle during the war, and in some ways the German military mind never solved it at all. After the war, when German commanders wrote and spoke about Bastogne, the bafflement lingered in their accounts. They had done everything correctly. Their plan had been sound, their assessment accurate, and their demand reasonable. And it had all come apart on the refusal of a scratch garrison to behave the way trapped armies behave. The men who had surrounded Bastogne were not fools, and they did not lose because they were outfought in any simple sense. In the first days of the siege, before the weather cleared, the Germans often had the advantage in numbers and firepower at the points of attack. They lost the Battle of Bastogne because the thing they were trying to break was not built in a way that could be broken by the means they brought. There is a temptation, in telling this story, to make it a simple tale of American toughness, of grit triumphing over odds. That version is not wrong exactly, but it is shallow. Toughness alone does not hold a perimeter for a week, and neither do interior lines and massed guns by themselves. Those advantages mattered, but they only mattered because the men inside the circle chose to use them, day after day, instead of accepting the surrender that the German note told them was the sensible choice. Underneath the tactics was a decision, made and remade in 1,000 foxholes, that this town would be held. That decision was the thing the German command could not break, because it did not live in any one place where a threat could reach it. That is the answer the German envoys could not read on the sheet of paper they were handed. They were looking for a single word that meant yes or no, and they found a word they could not pass, and they had to ask what it meant. But the word was never the real answer. The real answer was that the men inside Bastogne did not believe what the note told them to believe. The note said their position was hopeless. They looked at the same encirclement, the same odds, the same cold and hunger, and judged that they could hold, and so the demand did not move them, and there was no single place to apply the pressure even if it had. The Germans asked for the surrender of a commander, as though a town were a body that yields when its head is seized. They were facing a fight spread across miles of perimeter and shared among thousands of men, a defense with no single point, where a letter under a white flag could make it stop. Helmuth Henke, the lieutenant who carried the briefcase up the Arlon Road that December morning, survived the encounter and the war. He had walked toward the American lines, believing he was offering a doomed enemy a way out. He had walked back having been told, in the plainest possible English, to go to hell, and having watched a hopeless garrison refuse the only sensible course left to it. What he carried away was not a surrender, but a question, the same question that would outlast the war and outlast most of the men who fought it. How do you defeat an army that does not accept that it has lost? The Germans never found the answer at Bastogne. The town held. The roads stayed closed to them long enough that their offensive, already behind schedule, ground to a halt and then was driven back. Within weeks, the bulge their attack had punched into the Allied line was being erased, and the great gamble in the Ardennes had failed. Bastogne was not the only reason it failed, but it was among the most important, a stone in the river that the German flood could not move and could not flow past quickly enough. Anthony McAuliffe, the artillery officer who happened to be in command because his two superiors were away, went on to a long career and rose to high rank, but he was known for the rest of his life for a single word spoken in a moment of dismissive certainty. He never made grand claims about it. To him, it had not been a calculated act of defiance, just the natural response of a man who found the demand absurd. The men who served with him understood that this was precisely the point. The word was famous because it was honest. It expressed exactly what the defenders felt, which is why it has lasted, and why no one has ever needed to improve on it. The two Belgian nurses, the wounded who died for lack of surgeons on the first night, the young major who lost half his men holding a village, the gunners rationing 10 rounds a day, the tankers and engineers and lost stragglers gathered into a scratch force and told to hold. All of them were part of the answer that the single famous word only gestured toward. The defense of Bastogne belonged to all of them, and it is a flattening of the truth to let one general and one word stand in for what tens of thousands of men did in the snow. The Germans called many things about the Americans hard to understand, but this was perhaps the hardest. An army that was surrounded and acted as though it were not. An army that was offered an honorable escape from a hopeless position and answered with a word so casual its enemies could not tell whether it meant yes or no. The German command had a clear and rational theory of how the battle should go, and the men inside Bastogne refused to cooperate with it, not out of recklessness, but because they genuinely did not see their situation the way their enemies did. When you demand the surrender of men who do not believe they are beaten, the demand does not frighten them. It tells them you are the one who is worried. The defenders of Bastogne understood that, and they answered accordingly, and the answer has never needed translation again. Thank you for spending these minutes with these men. If this story reached you, a like is the single best way to help it find others who care about this history. If you are not subscribed, now is a good time, and the bell will make sure you never miss one of these. I would like to hear where you are watching from today. And if someone in your family served in the Second World War, a father, a grandfather, an uncle, a neighbor whose stories you grew up with, tell me about them in the comments. Most of those men never spoke of what they did. This is one way we make sure they are not forgotten.